Just in case everybody didn't know, this meeting is being recorded. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Legislative Task Force meeting. I'd like to welcome our special guest, Tom Tatum, who is joining us from Albany with ASBO. So as we start, let me ask Julie to please put our agenda up for today. So we could just go over briefly what we will be discussing. So we do have a guest speaker. Julie, you went way too fast. Go back, please. We have a guest speaker who is the Director of Government Relations for New York's ASBO, which is the Association for School Board Officers. School board officials, I'm sorry.
School business.
Okay, I always do it wrong. Okay, and then that's why we have Julie there. We will be going over some old business that we have, and we will have Ms. O'Hara will go over the civil service certification, any shared services with the town of North Hempstead or Nassau County, and then we will go to community comments. So with that, I am going to turn over the meeting to you, Ms. O'Hara, so you can do a formal introduction and not mess up the name like I keep doing, and then we could take it from there.
Sure, thank you very much. Again, my name is Kathy O'Hara. I'm Assistant Superintendent for Business. So just to explain a little bit about ASBO New York, each county has their own, well, there's 27 different chapters of school business officials who come together and they collaborate on different issues. This is actually the state level. So this is members from all across the state are represented through ASBO New York. So we come together, we have a government relation committee where Tom is the director of the government relations, and he works on setting draft bills for legislatures to represent the school district. So that's why I've invited Tom here. He's also very involved with the state ed department, and we have a budget proposal that ASBO New York creates along with NISCUS and NISBA. So I've asked Tom if he could come and speak with us because we do have different issues that we would like to pursue in Nassau. And Tom also gave a advocacy 101 presentation while I was up in Albany, and that I thought it would be beneficial for us. And I thought without taking us through the entire presentation, Tom could perhaps share with us just some tips for us. So with that, Tom, would you first like to talk to us about the budget and the lack of it being passed, right?
Yeah. So everybody, thank you for having me, and thank you, Kathy, for inviting me. The state budget is still, unresolved, and we're still waiting to see exactly when we'll reach the end of these negotiations. Late last week, we were hopeful that today would kind of be the turning point. So we're still remaining optimistic and, continuing our advocacy on that front. But there have been some pitfalls regarding some non-education related topics that have kind of held everything up. So until those get wrapped up, we will likely not see any definitive answers regarding the rest of the budget and the policies within it. We have heard rumors regarding what's in and what's out on some things that would have some tangential relation to education. However, until we get kind of final word and we see bill legislation, I don't like to speculate on those rumors too much. The positive thing for schools is that, unlike previous years where the legislature and the governor were really negotiating heavily over total aid to schools and foundation aid, and a lot of education heavy policies regarding funding. This year, it looks like we're going to just continue to see the agreement that was started last year, which is the phasing in of foundation aid so that all school districts are fully funded, with the fully funded expense-based aids being also included in the executive budget. So some of the traditional back and forth has been kind of taken out of that process, which is helpful, I think, for schools as they try to make long range financial plans and make decisions beyond simply 1 year.
That is good news.
Yeah. Kathy, I think you're muted if you're.
Sorry, I thought I unflipped it. Do you think that we'll receive additional funding from the first runs, or is it going to be kind of flat?
I think it would be best to plan on flat. Okay. Yeah, I would be planning on flat. We may see some additional targeted funding for specific things. But as far as kind of that general aid, I would consider flat the prudent choice there.
Tom, I'm sorry, you don't think there'll be a decrease?
No.
Right.
No, there's nothing to indicate a decrease. Everything we've seen is that they're considering adding money to the executive budget. The revenue projections that were included in January's executive budget proposal have been amended for additional aid, or for additional revenue rather. So it would be very surprising to see anything cut from education.
Some of the concerns are that this year we've received, like our school district received 2.3 million additional in foundation aid, which is the 4.6, it's like half of that. Mm-hmm. So there is some concern that it's being infused with federal funds, so that we've received it this year, but in the future, if you don't have that infusion of federal funds, what's going to be the impact? So what are you hearing up in Albany about the security, I guess, of the state's budget into the future?
Just so I understand, you're talking about the infusion of federal money into the general state budget, and that's why they were able to fully fund foundation aid, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So from the financial plan that the executive released and the comptrollers has reviewed, I think that overall the state is in very solid financial shape. Long range revenue, even absent additional federal funds, are strong through a combination of new revenue sources that are coming in, as well as a rebounding economy. Of course, that is always subject to things kind of outside of our control. But once we see foundation aid fully funded, it's difficult to imagine a world where we go back on that agreement to fully fund foundation aid without some sort of catastrophic event preceding that.
And they'll always be a hold harmless, basically, in foundation aid, correct?
I think as it currently stands, the historic precedent is yes, that the legislature and the executive do not like to reduce foundation aid to school districts. Moving forward, it's difficult to predict, especially as, once foundation aid is fully funded, there will be discussions regarding the future of education funding and updating the foundation aid formula and making modifications. The political ramifications of reducing aid to any school districts are extreme. especially to the legislative members who represent that district. And that's why you see such a long history of hold harmless being, the standard. So I think with that in mind, it's tough to see a world where it's not continued.
Could you also talk a little bit about the green legislation for like the electric buses? Even if it doesn't get attached to this budget, down the road, it is going to be something in the future. So could you speak to?
So I think that in general, the environmental concerns in the legislature have greatly had their voices greatly amplified over the past several years. We saw it with the large environmental legislative package that was enacted several years ago. We'll see it this November with the Green New York Bond Act being on the ballot. There's been a major push for implementing some of those policies across the state in the municipal level, which includes school districts. I think the most pressing among those is obviously the electric school bus policy and transition to electric school buses. Though it also, could include the transition to all electric appliances, which is something that looks like it may not be in this year's budget, but was very close to the finish line. So something to be aware of moving forward. The electric school bus mandate, I think the big hurdle for policymakers on that issue this year has just been a lack of information to school districts and a lack of answers to school district questions regarding how we would implement something as transformational as transitioning to electric school buses. I think that the prominent opinion across the state is that reducing emissions and improving air quality around school districts is important and something that we strive to do. But the specifics of how we get there is kind of what's been in discussion. So ASBO, along with the State Association of Superintendents, school boards, principals associations, administrators associations, all of us have been really active on this issue and just trying to ensure that any plan moving forward is realistic in its goals and the steps that we can take to get there. Even if this is not included in this year's budget, I think that this is a indicator of things to come. The Biden administration has also placed a emphasis on transitioning to electric school buses. So this is going to be a topic for the next, decade.
So I'm also wondering if that, not just school districts, but like at county levels, has there been any talk of incentivizing the counties to actually lay the infrastructure for this to happen?
Yeah. So one of the things that was in one of the One House budget proposals was actually additional money added onto the Environmental Bond Act in November. That money would be used for transitioning both school district fleets as well as your transportation authorities fleets to electric buses. I think that while there hasn't been a concrete framework established for cooperation between municipalities and school districts for those types of projects, it would fall in line with some of the countywide shared service frameworks that have been established in the past, and cooperation between municipalities and school districts and the state would be crucial for any sort of transition to be successful. One of the things that we've been pushing for is a roadmap developed by NYSERDA in conjunction with SED to really kind of lay out how infrastructure needs would be addressed both within school districts as far as like chargers and that, but also on a wider scale as far as, grid capacity, and sharing with other municipality agencies. But I don't have any specifics because it really all depends on what this budget entails, and then the regulations that come from there.
Thank you. Just one other question I had on a little different topic. I know you and I had discussed the civil service, kind of the frustrations and limitations that schools are having in hiring staff other than teachers because of the civil service.
Yeah.
I know that you've pursued some things, but we're running into a lot of roadblocks, like in Nassau, and I know Suffolk is also just trying to establish meetings with them. Like, from our perspective, what could we actually do on a local level with civil service to actually try and make a difference?
Yeah. So, it sounds like, and from our conversations we've had previously, I know that you've taken these steps, but really, because of the convoluted nature of civil service and the way it impacts school district operations, the best thing you can do as a school district is to try to have a good relationship with your local civil service director or commissioner, whatever your title may be. So having regular meetings with them beyond just when you need something. A lot of the type of points I discussed in my Advocacy 101 when it comes to developing a relationship with your legislator actually apply there as well. It's all about your relationship with them and maintaining that, so that you can have frank conversations of, we were looking to do this. What's the best route to get there? How can we solve this problem? Because in our conversations with the association that actually represents civil service commissioners and all of those folks, it seems like that's the major successful strategy that they've seen in other areas is a collaborative partnership and trying to maintain that as best as possible. I understand that it is extremely difficult to do that. So that's why we're also looking at some systemic reform and other things to improve the situation, because ultimately civil service commissioners at the local level are faced with constraints that are placed upon them by the state, who have constraints that are placed on them by the fact that they don't have funding. And it's difficult there's not a lot of people advocating for additional funding for a civil service department at the state level, especially compared to, a very engaged and activist population like school districts. So we're looking at ways to amplify some of their requests that would help school districts and other municipalities as well.
That's the thing, like, we have tried to meet with them because you do want to have a good relationship, because if you need something, they can be very helpful, but they can also not be helpful, so it's
I understand.
a balance we have to get through. But
I do understand.
I'm sorry, as a side note, in Nassau County specifically, we've had this past year, we had some turnover in the leadership at the county level. And when we did meet with and speak with our Nassau County legislator about civil service, the feedback we were given was, we just kind of need a little time because we're still trying to figure out what we're doing here with all of the, it was like a major change in the direction of the county. So I think, Kathy, to your question, and to the point that we've all been trying to do on this task force is building relationships. I think it sounds to me like this civil service attempt that we're trying to implement is going to be a longer project, more of a next year, definitely continuing, and hopefully they'll have had their opportunity at the county to get organized, and we can begin our relationship building there. But because I know you've tried, and we've been this is definitely one of the goals that this committee has had, is to try to make civil service a little bit more user friendly for school districts and not binding as many times it has been.
Yeah, and just to jump in here, Kathy's been a real leader in the civil service issue at the state level, and organized a group of us to get together, kind of a subset of the government relations committee, where we've met on this issue. And all things civil service, I think, are slow going. It's the nature of the
service.
Yeah, the nature of the system, that includes what you all have to do in trying to work with them to fill positions, but also applies to what we're working on as far as reforming the state legislation that impacts it, and finding areas where we can be helpful, because ultimately the goal is to ensure that school districts have the ability to provide the services they need to, and any hindrance on that is something we're looking to improve.
Julie, you have a question?
I just have a question on that front. And so do you, and I don't know if anyone on this call knows, I know, Kathy, I appreciate that you've been instrumental at the state level in initiating these conversations. And I do appreciate the relationship conversation. We've also talked about the power of numbers in some of these discussions, right? From a NYSBA standpoint, right, which is where the state board comes from, our organization, have they started any of the conversations regarding this on any of their advocacy platforms? I don't recall reading anything. Deb, I'm looking at you through Zoom to see if you've seen anything either. I know you follow it. And since Kathy started the conversations with you guys and more at a state level, is it helpful to bring in NYSBA also in that kind of, those discussions, and something that maybe we should try and pursue from our end as well, at least to start the conversation? Yeah.
So ASBO is a member of a organization called the Educational Conference Board, and that's comprised of sort of the major education organizations throughout the state, of which NYSBA and the Superintendents Association are both prominent and active. And we've already had some kind of preliminary conversations with the superintendents and NYSBA specifically about meeting up and kind of really diving into this issue post-budget. It's just kind of the nature of the political cycle in New York that until the budget is settled, everything else kind of gets backburnered a little bit. So this is definitely on the agenda for next time Greg and Brian and I get together. But they're great, and there's definitely strength in numbers. And anytime we have a meeting with state legislators, with just our organization, one of their first questions always is, where does NYSBA fall on this? Where does the Superintendents Association fall on this? Because their voices are equally as important when we're having these conversations.
And just one last thing, Tom, I know you and I spoke about it already, but one of the things on Long Island, and I'm not sure if across the state, we're having issues with transportation and those contracts, and our vendors being able to honor the contracts that have already been set into place. So we're trying to look at shared services also with like our county and other municipalities. Do you know of any other areas where they might share transportation with local counties? Like our Nassau County has a bus system set up. Like, is that
yeah, I do think that has been attempted, at least in some of the smaller city areas upstate. Syracuse comes to mind specifically. I'm not super familiar on how successful that was, or if there were any issues that arose because of that, but it's certainly something that we can help facilitate if that's something that your district's looking to do, because any chances to combine resources when possible is obviously helpful, especially when dealing with the bus driver shortage and general kind of labor shortages that we're seeing across markets.
I don't know if other people have questions.
I have one question, and then and then we can see if anyone else has questions. And it goes back to the budget that we're still waiting to see. So in the budget, there has been a discussion or a push for mental health funding. However, school districts such as ours are not eligible for the mental health funding because we don't have, I think, 55% free and reduced lunch population. So in my conversation with some of our state legislators, I pretty much advocated that mental health, and especially and I think the reason for the mental health push has been because of all of the implications of COVID and what it has done to students and staff and whatnot. We've all been affected in the same way, regardless of whether or not you're on a free or reduced. Do you know if there's been any change or anything or any discussion about including more mental health funding for everyone as opposed to just the 55% free and reduced?
I think that's a really important point, and it's something that ASBO, along with some of our other partner organizations, have brought up in our conversations, as well as the importance of offering these types of targeted funding to all school districts. And I mean targeted in the sense of, specific what they need to be used for. ASBO actually just put out a paper 2 weekends ago, on the subject of inflation and tax cap and the interplay between the two. Specifically, we really looked at Long Island and Hudson Valley, where school districts, such as yours, I'm assuming, judging by the previous comment, who are less reliant on state aid for their school budgets, but more reliant on local property taxes, are heavily impacted by the inflation that we're seeing across the state and the tax cap as a result, because of the inability to generate local revenue because of the tax cap and local voter concerns and many other things. They're kind of faced with a budget crunch that, even though they are, quote unquote, a wealthy school district with a lot of local resource capacity, they're unable to continue to provide the resources and services that they have because everything is increasing in price and their revenues are not increasing at the same pace. I think that argument has been heard by the legislature, and we'll continue to advocate that it is a more broad aid category as far as mental health moving forward. But I can't say for sure that it will.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. I mean, that advocacy is if we can get Kathy, I don't know if you've gotten a copy of that paper, but if we can get a copy of that paper, that would be helpful to us too, because exactly what you just said is the things that we as a school board are concerned about with our budget going into next year is, and as Kathy pointed out, we have transportation issues. That it would be very helpful that, for fun, we are in a situation where our school district relies, I think the number 6% was from our total budget is in a state aid. The rest of it is pretty much local funding, and our community has felt inflation and everything else the same.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandra, for posting the link in the chat.
Thank you, Sandra.
Really appreciate it. And just to build on that a little bit, we've had conversations with the media, especially our executive director Brian Chechnicki has had conversations with Newsday reporters and across the state media on this issue, specifically when looking at the local political tensions and local kind of tension surrounding school budgets and the like, where it's important that school districts get the accurate message out. I think that there, at least several months ago, was this thought in the general public that school districts are swimming in cash because they have federal money, they have state money, they have their local property taxes. Why would we ever raise taxes when we have all this money coming in. And so we've been doing a lot of work to ensure that the true kind of reality is out there as far as the limitations on those federal dollars, the desire to not create a budget gap or revenue cliff in the future for school districts. The fact that there's a lot of additional costs that school districts are bearing because of COVID-19, not to mention inflation, as well as the long-term impacts of not utilizing your tax levy, and how for any amount of money you don't levy for this year, that has dramatic impacts on your budgets for the rest of time.
Thank you. Yes. We actually also had, with same type of discussions with some community members when I think there was that when the original January news came out that I don't know how many billions were being given for education. Everybody thought everything's good, and we also had to just kind of try to put the reality on it as well.
And real quick, I'm sorry, just one other plug here on the reality. I think that's been something we've also been talking a lot statewide regarding fully funding foundation aid. We're thrilled that the commitment has been made to fully fund it. But one thing that's kind of lost in the shuffle is the fact that school districts have gone so long without this full funding foundation aid, right? This is the set amount of money that the courts had established that school districts were required to provide services that are constitutionally, required to provide. So there's also kind of a building back up of school districts that needs to occur, and building that capacity and building that resiliency, because we've seen it during COVID, we've seen it during other national and state emergencies. School districts are the centers of communities, so they need to have the resources to be able to offer that kind of cornerstone services to their students and families.
Agreed. Does anyone have any other questions Sandra?
Hi, I just had a question for Tom for the foundation aid. So I know obviously the big push right now is that it is fully funded, getting fully funded. And that's really the main focus for a lot of districts, just to get that funding in. And I know that with Port Washington, one thing that we've been seeing is that we're pushing for potentially the change in the formula. And I know that you said, one of the questions was, I think Emily asked what's the reality of this, or actually Ms. O'Hara might have said, the reality of this, the foundation aid being funded long-term, let alone change. Do you see, I saw one bill last year introduced, just trying to change the criteria for an increase in foundation aid by certain, 65% above the free and reduced by two assembly members last year. But do you see a lot of push for change in foundation aid formula, and kind of where maybe Port can focus on? I know that one bill really focused on certain criteria, right? Of just the focus on the free and reduced, the special needs, the amount of students with special needs, certain levels. So do you notice anything statewide where there is a focus on how to change the aid? I think, yeah.
That's a really good question. I think that the obviously the priority up till this point has been fully funding foundation aid, and that fight to fully fund foundation aid has taken years. First eliminating the GEA, restoring that funding, and then restoring foundation aid funding. It's been a long journey. That being said, because the foundation aid formula is almost 20 years old at this point, it is outdated in some of the metrics that it uses as its base. Off the top of my head, the biggest one there is the fact that it uses 2000 census data. That's written into the law. So at some point in the near future, there will have to be an updating of the formula in some capacity to some amount, just to look at that type of data that is actually being utilized by the formula. The other big one that's impacting, it won't be impacting Port Washington, I assume, but for community eligible programs for free lunch for all, that reduces sometimes the amount of frugal data you get, which is the free and reduced price lunch data you get. So there's kind of cascading effects there, where if you qualify for CEP, that's great for your community, but you may actually be hurting yourself in state aid as a result. So I believe it was the Senate, in one of the One-House legislature of the One-House bills on the budget, there was actually a small appropriation in there, a little over $1 million, to study foundation aid and to make recommendations on the improvements for,
It was the Senate. I think you're right. It was the Senate.
Thanks. It gets confusing with all of those types of proposals, but so that was included in the Senate proposal. I know it was a conversation at our last several ECB meetings. I think it will be, I would be very surprised to see no update take place. And I think that it will be beyond just updating the 2000 census data.
Which I was going to say with the census, I saw someone introduce a bill on that to change the census date. Like, I can't remember what date they listed. Maybe 2020, I think that was introduced.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe like our effort would be efficient of focusing on pushing our own legislators for the same type of bill, of introducing a similar bill or supporting a similar bill? Because I think with the such an old census for Port Washington, we've changed a lot in the last 10 years. And that would be a huge benefit for us, whereas that some towns haven't changed as much demographically over the last 10 years. So really for like efficient legislation, would it be something that you maybe see that would benefit us to kind of push towards that as an initial step of focusing on the change of the census year? Or is that already like being seen and not really efficient for us to kind of voice to our legislators?
So, I mean, I think it's definitely important to voice to your legislators the desire to update foundation aid formulas, to take a look at improving the way in which we allocate resources to school districts. I will say that those types of standalone bills don't generally have a great success rate as far as becoming enacted, because the foundation aid formula and school aid funding is such a large part of the state budget. It will probably be part of a state budget package in the coming years. That being said, having language drafted, having a bill in place does make it easier to have those conversations. So, I can't make a recommendation on specifically what you should do, but having those conversations with your legislators is always valuable. And those types of bigger conversations are, I think, great in developing those relationships and strengthening those relationships you already have, because it can be a real back and forth opportunity to discuss the issue rather than say, here's what we want you to do, please do it.
So we were part of a discussion before COVID. Shelley Mayer, who was the education committee chair, had kind of started a roundtable of school districts and board members, superintendents that talked about how we would restructure the formula. And then, of course, COVID took place and everything got put aside. So we hope to be part of those discussions again going forward, with any new strategies of how we can, so if I know you and Kathy are in communication, so if you hear something, if we haven't heard it, and if you hear that the roundtable is starting again, we would be appreciative to have that ability to have that seat at the table again if we don't have that information on our own.
Of course.
Because we do know that, like we said, we only receive so a school district like ours is mostly funded by our local, taxpayers. But there are other school districts, what we found at that roundtable that we were at, there were other school districts that are funded primarily by state aid, and changing the foundation aid formula may be to their detriment. So that we know that there has to be a balance on when that formula, ultimately is changed. So having voices like ours at the table, I think, is important, because it shouldn't be to a loss to a school district. Like, again, and especially when, we're talking all across the state about equity, there should be equity in a formula like that, which I know, I'm just kind of just saying something just to make sure it's on record.
I understand.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Any more government relations type questions? Matt?
You guys hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I had to change rooms. The dog was barking. So this may or may not be the right forum, but I think it could be, as far as just planting some seeds for the conversation. But I was in a subcommittee meeting probably mid-year last year around the Assembly Standing Committee on Health. And they were talking about, at the time, COVID was obviously surging and peaking, and they were talking about budget changes at a mass scale for ventilation improvements in schools. And they're like, we'll get to it, we'll figure it out. But the threshold, the cost was going to be so high to implement changes at a mass scale. And anything small that we could do, we did, right? The HEPA filters. But at the time, the conversation was kind of punted to like, hey, this is such a large consideration that would require significant changes to the budget. Let's come back to it at another time. And whether that was from an educational perspective or a health perspective, it just kind of got shelved. And talking about the budget now triggered this memory for me, where I don't know that anyone else has revisited it, but when there are such large institutional requirements for wholesale budgetary investment for things like ventilation improvements, and I know, the U.S. Department of Education came out with some guidelines and for improvement, but I don't think that the ARP even addressed it. So how do we begin to kind of chip away at some of those things, knowing it's probably a multi-year concept at the very best, and then activation, long term? Is this the right group to discuss that? But I feel like as we're talking about,
I think your question is a good question with regards to has there been any sort of discussion like that in Albany regarding funding for schools? And then, so I think that's a good question, Matt.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that air quality, HVAC systems, ventilation systems have been discussed. There's no specific large type of proposal included in this budget. There are some smaller things that we've been advocating for that were included in one houses that I think would be beneficial for some of these projects. The biggest one in that regards is capital outlay projects. I'm not sure how familiar you all are, I assume fairly, but basically increasing the dollar threshold for which you can use a capital outlay project, as well as allowing greater flexibility. So there are basically two proposals out there right now. One which would simply increase the outlay cost to $250,000, so 2.5 times the current amount, which opens up the doors to a lot of new projects that can be utilized under this program. The other would actually increase it to $250,000 plus a regional wage index, up to a total of $500,000 per project. That proposal also includes the ability to combine up to 5 years of capital outlay projects into a single request and reimbursement. So you could effectively get up to $2.5 million to do a series of large projects, or a series of projects rather. It doesn't have to be one, it could be 5, to improve your buildings. So it's not quite the grand infrastructure that is probably needed. I know on the national level, that is something that's also being discussed pretty heavily. ASBO International is a group. I'm on their government affairs committee. So there's, these levels of participation on committees, it seems like, but that group has been very active on the infrastructure needs of schools, because all of the research that we've seen over the past decade or two is that air quality has such a dramatic impact on student performance, and it's only going to continue to trend up in importance, especially as we're dealing with extremes in weather and climate. HVAC systems and air quality are all going to be very important.
Do you think, Tom, that there are other, so I guess to Matt's question also, with regards to this committee, would it be worth our time, and would it be a wise choice of our time actually to be advocating or start discussing, maybe advocating for a bigger sense? Because even if this project is $2.5 million in our particular school district, and when we talk about upgrading for all our ventilation and the potential of maybe putting it's $70 million. So
astronomical, yeah.
Right. So but if there was funding that came from the state, or came from, was included in some sort of it would help us in a, it would take it basically out of our lane and put it in.
Yeah.
So do you think that it's a good time for us to maybe start talking about those type of advocacy efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's only going to grow in importance, filtration and HVAC systems and school infrastructure as a whole. I would say that a lot of what is your top priority probably depends on what we see in the budget, right? If we do see a electric bus mandate in this year's budget, depending on how aggressive that timeline is, that might eat up a lot of your advocacy time. Correct. As far as ensuring that. I will say that infrastructure in particular, it's important to discuss those issues not only with your state representatives, with your congressional representatives as well. I know that there was a big push to get student or school infrastructure included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was not successful to the extent that we were all hoping. So those types of conversations are also beneficial because the more money that's flowing from the federal government for these programs helps the state make better decisions and easier decisions with what they want to use their resources for.
So Matt, the answer to the question was yes, this is the right forum. You got muted now. Now we can't hear you.
I was going to say, I didn't have an answer. I had more of the question, but knowing that this is something you probably need to chip away at over time is start now.
Okay.
There's not many issues that are quick solves in this field.
Oh, we have another special guest, Dr. Michael Hines. He's our superintendent. Okay. Does anybody so I think we've gotten a lot of valuable information. Unfortunately, we're all still waiting for the good old budget to be passed, to be finalized. But I think you've helped us kind of set the tone for what we could maybe see in this budget. And we did discuss the foundation aid. We did discuss the fact that we need those advocacy services, the civil service limitations, and how building relationships both with our civil service commissioner and with our legislators will be important as far as making changes, and that you are in fact advocating on a state level, both with the Superintendent Association and with NYSBA, to get that all hopefully changed. We also just had a great idea and a thought process for maybe having advocacy efforts on a more of a global kind of way, not global, but meaning federally and with our state legislators for improving our ventilation and HVAC systems. And so that could definitely be something that we can be looking forward to talking about after this budget process, and as it would be a long-term project. Did I miss anything in what we discussed, or did I think I got that. Deborah, you have a question?
I do. It's probably more for Kathy. I understand we're expecting the state aid runs today. Maybe, right? So this is my question. If there's no budget that's approved, how does that affect our timeline in terms of getting the numbers out and approving the budget and getting that out to the community and the day of voting for the budget? Does our timeline change, or is it still the same and we just kind of go on the fly?
Well, I think before you answer, Kathy, I think the one thing that Tom did answer with that question when Kathy asked him is plan on it being flat to January. So I think, right? So I'm guessing that Kathy's going to use the flat number from January, but Kathy.
And will that affect anything going forward, or can you rely on that number predictably and keep our timeline the way it is?
Sure. So this is a question that came up among different schools. They were actually polling and saying, are you going to put off adopting your budget until you see the state runs? But I think our district is in a good place, and I don't think we need to push back our timeline, because the runs that we saw in January, that's the worst case scenario, really. So I think forming our budget around that, and it's looking at the expenditure side of it. So I think it's good to go forward with it. And if we do have more revenue, then we would be able to add it to our reserves for next year, And also what is projected in the runs, we don't always receive if it's that's a frozen database. So there could be some room in there that we don't receive all of that funding. So
which is actually which is true, right? We don't always get what the runs say we're getting. So it's interesting that, right, we sometimes forget about that. What is Kathy, is the 18th the absolute last day, right? Like enough
it's the 14th. The 25th, I believe, is the actual requirement, but there's certain publications that we need to, I'm already late with them because we haven't completely decided. So I'm kind of behind the gun with that.
Right, because we have to publish the budget card. There's
the budget notice and everything.
The ballot, right? That all of that, which unfortunately has to get done within a certain time frame. So okay, well, we're gonna go and we're gonna be pleased with all the extra money we're gonna get.
But Tom, do you have a sense of when it might be adopted, or nobody really knows? It's not going to be today, correct?
No, I wouldn't think it would be today. They have stated that they would be utilizing a message necessity, most likely, to waive the 3-day aging process that's generally in place for bills. I will say that the impact a late state budget has on school districts, as far as operationally and with those types of requirements that you guys were discussing just previously, has been discussed with policymakers, so they're aware of the implications that a continued late budget has on operations. So what that means is, I'm not sure how they're going to resolve those issues, but they're at least aware that there is real world kind of impact to continuing their negotiations beyond what we've already seen.
And what is it that's actually holding up the budget?
It is a combination of bail reform and childcare provisions, it seems like, at this point.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Dr. Hines, I know you just joined us, but does any?
No, sorry, I'm early. My apologies. I hope you had a meaningful, and I'm sure you did, discussion. And Tom, thank you for joining us. Very much appreciated. with your expertise. No, I have no questions at this moment. It's just, we thought it would be today. Well, first we thought it was the first, then we were hoping for today. I'm not counting on tomorrow. So, but the good news is, from a budgetary standpoint, from where we stand as a school district, I think we are in a very good place, with a very student-centered, child-centered budget. So that's the good news. And I appreciate everyone's efforts in being here today and everything that you do.
Thank you. Julie, could you please put up the next meeting dates? So thank you.
Actually, should we let Tom go? Because he's
Yes,
possibly.
yes, Tom,
right.
thank you
Thank
very
you so much.
Tom, thank you.
Thank you for
Yes.
Thanks for
joining us.
having me. If you have any questions that come up, you think of something, feel free. Kathy can get you all my contact information, and it's also available on the ASBO website.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Okay, I just wanted to put up that our meeting date. So our next meeting is scheduled for June 9th. I think, and that's all I really, because Julie, I need you to put up the date because I couldn't remember it. So June 9th is our next meeting date. I think we do have, Kathy, I guess the question I have is, do you want to give any other further reports on the civil service meetings other than what we discussed today, or the shared services with Town of North Hempstead?
Sure, I did want to mention something about the shared services, because I did bring it up with my colleagues in surrounding districts. One of the items I thought was very interesting with the town, I think it's Oyster Bay, they actually contract for street sweeping services with the town. And they said it was a big cost savings and it was done properly. So I had spoken with our director of facilities, Mr. Sano, and he said that our people do it in-house. So that could be something that we would want to pursue, because we did contract out at some point, but it was very expensive and they didn't do a very good job. So I was thinking that was one thing. Another thing was possibly maintenance of our vehicles. We currently use Jericho to do the maintenance on our buses, but I was wondering if the town has some type of maintenance department that could work on our vehicles, like even the trucks that we have or some of the buses. I don't know if it would be comparable to what another school is discussing. And then also the transportation. Just kind of asking the town of North Hempstead, do they have any intentions with the electric bus mandate that is in the future? I don't know if specifically for towns or counties that's going to be a mandate, but I would think they'd want to also be part of this green initiative. So I think that's something I would recommend pursuing.
Okay, so that we can certainly set up a meeting with our town. We can go to the town supervisor, but our town council person would be, I think, very open to having a meeting with us to discuss the possibility of shared services. I don't know that I don't think the town of North Hempstead has any transportation services, like the buses are run by Nassau County.
Mm-hmm.
But we can certainly have a conversation about any of that. So we could invite Mary Ann Del Monte, who is our town council person, to our next meeting on June 9th, and we can ask if she could, and maybe if she would like to include the supervisor. We can also obviously invite the supervisor as well, or anybody in that she would think would be appropriate in discussing these types of topics. If everybody's okay with that, or thinks that's a good idea, we can certainly pursue that and have even maybe more general discussion of any types of shared services that the town had and the school district could share. Then I think that if everybody's okay with that, if anyone has no objection, I think that we can proceed with that. We can invite Mary Ann Del Monte and then have that conversation amongst all of us with her. Sound good? Okay. With regards to civil service, like I said, I think I know you've been trying to meet with the commissioner. I had reached out and spoken to our legislator sometime, I think in January. regarding the civil service. And she did ask at that point to just kind of wait a little bit because there was so much going on at the county level. They didn't know who was staying, who was going, and where they would be ending up. So we could also try to have that conversation again and see if there's an opportunity for having another meeting. But because like we've said, this is going to be a long-term conversation. So we can certainly have that. And maybe we do that in June. Maybe we invite both, or we just wait till September for the civil service part. But I could certainly follow up with that.
Sure. See, the civil service is actually it's very important because there's all of the schools surrounding us in our quadrant basically are going through the same problem, and just trying to appoint people provisionally. And then if a test does come, like they have a test that's like 2 years old, there's 200 people on that test. And if you canvass it, only 2 people respond. So it's hard to fill positions and run a school district efficiently, kind of. So it is something we'd like to do sooner. And we are going to keep trying to say, hey, when can we just get on the calendar so we have something to.
So you've tried to reach out to the Civil Service Commissioner and you haven't been able to get a meeting?
Right. Elaine Fennick has actually reached out because
so
her
that's
organization and us.
Right. So that's the one thing we can definitely do, is try to see if we can get you, like maybe that's one thing we can ask our legislator to help even facilitate that meeting, right? Just even get
Sure,
you.
but I don't want to step on anyone's toes
No.
going over their head,
No, I understand.
because I want them to be our friend.
Right. We have to build the relationship. Right. Right. Okay.
Okay.
Does anybody else have anything else did I miss anything, Julie? No,
Nope.
She's okay. Any other ideas, suggestions? No? Okay, well.
Have no attendees for community comments.
No,
also.
I saw that. I was checking that as well. Okay, so thank you, everybody. We will all meet again on June 9th, unless I forgot it already. My Alzheimer's went in. Is it June 9th? Yes, June 9th. We will be meeting in person. I will ask to see if Marianne Del Monte can join us so we can talk about shared services with the town of North Hempstead. And in the meantime, we will also try to see if we can help facilitate a meeting or get a meeting on the calendar with the Civil Service Commissioner, and try to get some of that done as well. We're all going to be staying tuned to when the state aid when the state budget gets approved, and hopefully we'll have a surplus of dollars. We are going to start talking about, and I think if we're going to wait until maybe September to start having the conversations about our advocacy efforts on the HVAC factor that you brought up in ventilation services. I mean, certainly we can have the conversation in June. It might even be an opportunity to have a conversation with the town and see, if they have any suggestions on that. One thing we did hear is that we should have advocacy efforts on that effort with our federal legislators as well as our state legislators. So that is also something that we're going to keep on our radar as well. We do know that we're going to have a new woman come November. So that is something we also should, although maybe we should just try to get as much money now before we lose the congressman. But we will continue those efforts. Julie, did you want to say something?
No, you covered it. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, and see you in June.
Thank you.
Okay. All righty. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.